Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Yossi Goslin, and today I want to talk about the New York Knicks, who I think arguably have the most fascinating offseason that's not a cap space team. And the reason is because they've got a couple key players who they're going to try to bring back. They're going to be due for some big raises, but at the same time, another offseason, another round of speculation of will the Knicks finally land the star? Because they've been loading up on assets and they position themselves to have such a deep roster to sustain the acquisition of a potential star. So, will they be able to find one? Well, and what kind of star should they go for? Because it seems like they have a pretty good roster, especially in their starting five. What position do you look to upgrade? And I want to go over some contract scenarios for their key players, try to project the payroll over the next 2 years, and go over hypothetical trades, especially in regards to some of the new trade rules that were implemented in the new CBA, mainly because there are new trade rules in the CBA that could affect the type of trade they make and could trigger hard caps. But I want to show how they'll still be able to navigate a deep roster while getting a star player. So here are the Knicks payroll so far for the upcoming season. Biggest thing is that I excluded OG Anunoby's 19.9 million player option. I think he's declining that. He's in a position where he's going to get a much bigger deal. So a more accurate representation of their payroll so far, it's in the $130 million range. So they're projected to be roughly 30 million below the luxury tax line, and they still need to fill two more rosters, which are presumably at least OG Anunoby and Isaiah Hartenstein. So signing both players most likely will take them over the luxury tax for this upcoming season and potentially the first apron. And I'll get into what how that can impact things, but first and foremost, when you look at the free agents, because of the financial crunch that's going to happen by bringing back Anunoby and Hardenstein, Precious Achua is all but gone. He was had great production this year, but the Knicks will definitely be priced out for him. Only way he comes back is if Isaiah Hardenstein somehow doesn't. Now, if the tax is a concern, they could easily get under there by cutting Bojan Bogdanovic. He's got a $19 million salary with only partially guaranteed for $2 million. The guarantee date is right before the start of free agency. However, I think that they are going to preserve his contract for trade purposes, mainly because that $19 million could go a long way. And when you look at the rest of the roster and who they're going to want to prioritize to keep, I don't think that they'd want to send out Josh Hart or Mitchell Robinson or Dante DiVincenzo for matching salary. Bojan Bogdanovic not quite into the Knicks' long-term plans makes a lot more sense as that salary filler. So as I mentioned earlier, OG Anunoby has a $20 million player option that he's going to decline. And as I mentioned earlier, OG Anunoby has a $20 million player option that he's going to decline. And that's because the salaries for the top sub all-star level wings have risen over the years, starting from his previous contract with the Raptors. Mikal Bridges then got 4 for 90, and last year Jaden McDaniels got 5 for 135. Jeremy Grant got 5 for 160 million. So he'll be able to extend with the Knicks only on June 30th, which is the day before free agency, for 4 years, 117 mil, which he's not going to take because just based on those contracts I just outlined, that's far below what market value is now. In fact, I think OG Anunoby's next contract is going to significantly surpass all those deals I just mentioned and become the new market setter for this type of player type, especially since I think he's the best one from that group. I think he's probably going to get somewhere between 35 to 40 million annually on his next deal. And when projecting ahead, I'm just going to use like a 40 million type of annual range because look, it might seem high, but when projecting going forward, just best to go higher. And I do get the feeling he is going to get his rate pushed up potentially by the Sixers. Maybe they want to throw out like a spite short-term max offer just to make it harder on the Knicks. But this is a projection I made where he gets 40 million a year, starts as low as 35 million with full 8% raises. So it would age pretty well, especially with the salary cap set to rise 10% over the next few seasons. Now, there's some fear among Knicks fans I know whether the Knicks truly have enough to pay Isaiah Hartenstein, and I think they do. The Knicks can give him a maximum of 4 years, 72 million. That's because they have his early bird rights. The first year salary It's 175% of his 99.2 million salary from last season. So that would start at 16.2 million. And look, the market isn't great for centers right now. I think that most of the teams that do need a center won't be able to offer more than what the Knicks can. All these teams have is the mid-level exception starts at just below 13 million. And then when you look at the cap space teams, there's like Detroit, Philly, Orlando, Charlotte, just to name a few, maybe Oklahoma City. But I don't really think any of these teams are in a position where they need to throw a lot of money at a center. So with that said, the Knicks also can't afford to lose him. So he's got a good amount of internal leverage on the Knicks. And in negotiations, I think there's a good chance he gets this full amount because it's gonna be hard to justify him getting anything less, especially since they just gave Mitchell Robinson for 60 a couple of years ago. So maybe there could be some team friendly parts on the back end, maybe like a team option, which would make his deal pretty identical to what Josh Hart extended to last offseason. But ultimately, I think that the Knicks do have enough rights where both sides should come to an agreement. So if we project the Knicks with all those amounts I just gave out to OG Anunoby and Isaiah Hartenstein, they would have a modest tax payment and a roster exceeding $200 million. It would put them over the first apron, but just below the second after filling out the rest of the roster. When it comes to projecting the payroll next year, the first thing we got to figure out is how much Jalen Brunson is going to make. He is set to make $25 million in the upcoming season and then has a player option worth the same amount for the following in 25-26. He is set to become extension eligible starting this summer for 4 years, 156.5 million. If this is the Jalen Brunson that we saw in the playoffs, if this is the version we're going to keep seeing for the next 4 years, then this contract is too low for him. That's because he could earn significantly more as a free agent in 2025, when he could earn a max contract with the Knicks for up to 5 years projected at 270 million. That might seem like a lot, but that's also much less than the supermax, which he will not be able to qualify for. So this contract not only gives Brunson an extra year, but he's getting significantly higher salaries, which would allow him to earn 52 million more over the next 4 seasons versus that extension he's allowed to take. So if he does take this extension, I would be pretty surprised, and he'd be doing the Knicks a pretty big favor to their cap sheet. So now if we look at the Knicks the following season with those projections I made for OG Anunoby, Isaiah Hartenstein, and Jalen Brunson earning his max contract, also keep in mind Bojan Bogdanovic would have expired by now, and I put some draft picks. They have a lot of draft picks coming, which I'm sure they'll move by then. But when they get to a full roster, I've got them just slightly above the tax, slightly above the first apron. And even if Julius Randle, who will be extension eligible this upcoming season, gets a higher starting salary than this $30.9 million player option, they're still going to be pretty well below the second apron. And that's pretty big for the Knicks. If they're going to keep this roster and not get a star, they might as well stay below the second apron since there's some draft pick penalties by staying above it. They would lose. They would have their draft pick 7 years ahead frozen, so they can't trade it. And being over the second apron again could then move that draft pick to the end of the first round. So they're in a great spot to avoid any significant financial issues or draft pick penalties, even if they pay their guys a little more than expected. Now it is important to note that there are new trade rules in the CBA that could complicate the type of deals the Knicks could do. That's because taking in more salary than they're sending out or aggregating players can trigger certain hard caps. However, even with all these projections I laid out, they can pay their guys and still comfortably pursue a star trade, which is why now I want to get into some hypotheticals and get into my favorite pipe dream star scenario. Giannis Antetokounmpo to the Knicks. So the reason I want to discuss Giannis is mainly one, I could see the Bucks eventually going another direction. I think their window is going to run out soon. Two, if the Knicks are going to pursue a star, which position did they need to go for? I think they're pretty set at guards, pretty set at center, and OG's taking one of the forward spots. An upgrade at the four seems like the most sensible. And then the other thing though is Giannis is making close to $50 million, and the idea to show that if the Knicks can acquire a player as expensive as Giannis, and there really isn't that many more expensive players, then it's just a great way to show the high end of their payroll outcomes. Now, they also, I think they have enough to trade for a guy like Giannis. They have up to 8 first round picks they can trade this summer. And I think that if a star player like him becomes available, they'll have an adequate offer. Now, the key for the Knicks to pull this off salary matching wise is to send out more salaries than they're sending back. Doing this will allow them to stay above the first apron, which in most of the projections I've shown, that's going to be the case. But they're also aggregating multiple players. They're sending 3 players to match for Giannis because they need to combine these salaries to get to that amount. Doing that now in the CBA, in this new CBA, will hard cap teams under the second apron. But that's okay because, as I explained, it's probably best for the Knicks to stay below it, and you'll see they are gonna be able to stay below it as well. Now, if such a trade like this now, if such a trade like this were to happen, it'd probably be expanded into multiple teams. So these players don't particularly have to go to Milwaukee in this scenario. Just an example to show what the Knicks need to send out from their perspective to make it work. So here's a projection for the Knicks if they're able to trade for Giannis next season. If you're wondering why Giannis' salary is that, you looked it up, it was something a little smaller. It's because he got a trade bonus, which would elevate his salary to this amount of traded. So if we plug him in for the players that has sent down the hypothetical trade, Julius Randle, Bojan Bogdanovic, Jericho Sims, once they get to 14 players, which is the roster requirement, they still have like a pretty low tax payment, relatively speaking. They're well over the first apron, which is fine, but they are able to finish just below the second apron, which I explained they'd now be hard capped to after making this trade. So if we project to the following season, that's when things get extremely expensive when you factor in a likely max contract for Jalen Brunson as well. So when you fill out the rest of the roster, you'll see they've got a lot of draft picks coming up. I'm sure they'll get moved, but I'm just going to keep them in for now. Their roster is going to exceed 300 million with the luxury tax payment projected to exceed 100 million dollars alone. And I'm sure the Knicks will gladly pay for this team if they are producing. The only real downside is that they're going to be most likely over the second apron. But, if this team is doing what's expected, maybe the Knicks would be okay with dealing with these draft pick penalties for a year or two. Now, as fun as a star trade scenario is, I think it's still pretty unlikely that a front court player of that caliber even becomes available, mainly because every team wants to be good now. And I just look around, I don't know how many of those players are going to be available in the near future. But even if a star player isn't available, the alternative is really great, meaning keeping the same group around. And that's because the Knicks are going to be able to keep such a high level of depth while keeping expensive pretty reasonable over the next few seasons. These player contracts that I project are generally in the higher end outcome of scenarios. And I think they're pretty properly paid, but even if the contracts don't quite work out, even if they are a little overpaid, so to speak, that's fine because even with all these projections, it still fits really well within the Knicks' plans. And that's why they're in just such a great spot going.